The dining table is set for 40 guests. Crystal glasses, fine wine, still cooling, plates of meat waiting by the fire. In a mansion so new the paint barely had time to age. The soldiers who walk in are starving. They have marched 50 miles through killing heat. And so they sit down in the president's dining room. And they eat the president's dinner. They raise the president's wine in a mocking toast to his health. Then they stack the furniture into piles. And they burn his house to the ground. This is not a movie. This is the night of August 24th, 1814. The White House is on fire. The Capitol is on fire. The flames rise so high that people in Baltimore, 40 miles away, can read by the glow on the horizon. The capital of the United States has fallen to a foreign army. It remains, to this day, the only time in history that has ever happened. But here is what makes this story almost impossible to believe. The invaders held the city for barely 26 hours and then vanished. Not because of any American army, because of something no general on earth could have planned. Stay with me, because the ending of this story is stranger than the fire. To understand how enemy boots ended up on the president's carpet, you have to go back 2 years to a war almost everyone has forgotten. In June of 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain. On paper, the reasons were serious. The Royal Navy was stopping American ships at sea and kidnapping the sailors, dragging them off to serve on British warships. By some counts, close to 10,000 men taken. Imagine that today. A foreign power pulling your citizens off ships and putting them in uniform at gunpoint. But behind the outrage was something more dangerous: confidence. Britain was locked in a death struggle with Napoleon in Europe. Her armies were an ocean away, and a generation of young American politicians, the war hawks, saw a once-in-history opening. Thomas Jefferson himself declared that taking Canada would be a mere matter of marching. Remember that sentence. History certainly did. The marching did not go as advertised. The invasions of Canada collapsed one after another. Armies surrendered. Generals blamed each other. The mere matter of marching became a catalogue of humiliations. But in April of 1813, the Americans finally landed a blow. They captured York, the town we now call Toronto. And before they left, they burned its parliament buildings to ashes, a government building, deliberately torched. In London, they took note. In the Royal Navy, they took note. And one officer in particular, a raider named Rear Admiral George Cockburn, already burning his way up and down the Chesapeake Bay, began to dream about a very specific kind of receipt. The Americans had set fire to a capital. Someone was going to return the favor. For 2 years, the United States survived on one piece of luck. Britain was too busy fighting Napoleon to send her real army. Then, in April of 1814, the luck ran out. Napoleon abdicated. The wars in Europe were over, and suddenly, thousands of the most experienced soldiers on the planet, men who had broken French armies in Spain, had nothing to do. Britain loaded them onto ships and pointed them at America. Now comes the part of this story that hurts, because Washington saw it coming. All through the summer of 1814, the warnings piled up. A massive British fleet in the Chesapeake, troop transports, veteran regiments. The capital lay barely 40 miles from open water, defended by almost nothing. President James Madison begged his cabinet to prepare, and his own Secretary of War, a man named John Armstrong, looked at the map and delivered one of the most catastrophic judgments in American history. The British, he insisted, would never bother with Washington. It was a swampy village of 8,000 people. No industry, no treasure, no military value. He refused to fortify the city. He refused to mass troops. As the enemy fleet grew, he all but shrugged. So watch this now with the sickening advantage we have over the people in this story. Watch the clerks filing papers, the families planning dinners, the president's wife sending out invitations, while 4,500 veterans of the Napoleonic Wars sharpen their bayonets just down the river. On August 19th, the British landed at a sleepy tobacco port called Benedict, Maryland, and began to walk. No cavalry, no heavy cannon, just infantry under Major General Robert Ross, marching 50 miles through the worst heat Maryland could summon. It was so brutal that the campaign killed men before the Americans ever fired a shot. Soldiers in wool uniforms, veterans of Spain, dropped dead of heat stroke in the dust. And still they came, eating dust, drinking from streams, closing in on a capital that could not decide if it was even a target. By the morning of August 24th, only one thing stood between them and Washington, a town called Bladensburg. On paper, the Americans should have won, between 6,000 and 7,000 defenders, against roughly 4,500 exhausted British. The Americans had more men, more guns, and the defensive side of a river. But most of them were militia, farmers and shopkeepers with muskets, some of whom had been soldiers for less than a week. And the British brought something the militia had never seen: Congreve rockets, screaming iron tubes of fire that corkscrewed through the sky with a sound like the air itself tearing open. The rockets were wildly inaccurate, militarily, almost useless. Psychologically, they were perfect. The British attacked at noon. The rockets shrieked over the American lines, and the American army simply ceased to exist. Entire regiments turned and ran without firing a shot. Not retreated. Ran. Through fields, through fences, through the streets of Washington itself. The rout was so total, so fast, so absurd, that Americans would mockingly name it after a horse race, the Bladensburg races. And in the middle of this collapse stands a small, frail man of 63, President James Madison himself, who had ridden out to watch the battle and nearly trotted straight into the British advance guard. The father of the Constitution, under enemy rocket fire, watching his capital's last shield dissolve in front of him. He turned his horse toward the city to warn his wife. One group did not run. Remember them, 500 sailors and Marines under Commodore Joshua Barney, flotilla men who had already scuttled their own boats rather than surrender them, planted their cannons across the road and stood. Twice they threw back British charges. Barney's guns tore holes in veteran regiments until the ammunition wagons fled with the militia, and the position drowned in redcoats. Barney took a musket ball in the thigh, and when the British commanders reached the wounded old sailor, they did something strange. They saluted him. General Ross paroled him on the spot, in honor of the only Americans that day who had acted like an army. Even your enemies keep score. While Bladensburg collapsed, the strangest dinner party in American history was refusing to end. At the president's mansion, Dolly Madison had ordered the table set for 40 guests. A victory dinner, scheduled with fatal confidence. Now she stood at the windows with a spyglass, watching the road, waiting for her husband while the sound of cannon rolled closer. Friends begged her to run. Wagons were waiting. The city was emptying around her like water from a cracked jug. And this woman, this Quaker-raised socialite in silk, looked around the mansion and decided the British could have almost everything. Almost. On the wall of the dining room hung a full-length portrait of George Washington. Dolly understood exactly what it would become in enemy hands. A trophy, a joke. The father of the country, paraded through London or fed to a bonfire while soldiers laughed. She refused to leave while it hung there. The problem: the frame was screwed into the wall and the minutes were bleeding out. So she gave the order: break it. The mansion's staff, including a 15-year-old enslaved boy named Paul Jennings, who decades later would write down what he saw, smashed the frame apart and the canvas was pulled free and handed to two passing New Yorkers with instructions to hide it at any cost. Dolly grabbed a copy of the Declaration of Independence, red velvet curtains, what silver she could carry, and fled. By some accounts, the British were in the city within hours of her carriage wheels leaving the drive. That painting hangs in the White House today. It is the only object that has been there since before the fire, because one woman weighed her life against a piece of canvas and hesitated. At dusk, the conquerors walked into the capital of the United States and found it almost empty. Someone fired on the British from a house, killing General Ross's horse. The house was burned. Then the army moved, with eerie discipline, to the Capitol building. Soldiers packed the Congress with gunpowder and rocket fuel. The House chamber, the Senate, the Supreme Court, which met in the basement, and the Library of Congress, 3,000 volumes of a young nation's memory. All of it went up in one roar of flame. Then they marched down the avenue to the president's house. And there they found the dinner, the table for 40, the wine, the meat still warm by the fire. The officers sat in the president's chairs and ate his food while their men wandered the rooms, pocketing souvenirs. Admiral Cockburn, the raider who had dreamed of this night, took an old hat of Madison's and a cushion from Dolly's chair, joking crudely about the First Lady. He raised a glass and toasted to Jemmy's health, using the president's nickname like a knife. Then 50 men surrounded the mansion, hurled torches and fire poles through the windows, and the president's house became a single column of flame. The Treasury followed, the War Department. The Americans themselves torched their own Navy yard, 2 warships and mountains of supplies, rather than let them be captured. That night, the sky above Washington glowed so violently that witnesses said you could read a newspaper miles outside the city. In Baltimore, 40 miles away, people stood on rooftops and watched their capital burn on the horizon. The government of the United States was scattered across the countryside. The president was a refugee sleeping in borrowed houses. His wife was disguised in a farm wagon. The republic was 25 years old. And on the morning of August 25th, it looked exactly like what the empire had always said it was. A failed experiment. If your heart is pounding right now, this is what we do here. We find the night's history almost ended, and we live inside them. Subscribe, because you will want to be here for what happens next. Because at noon on August 25th, with the British still holding the smoking city, the sky itself took a side. It began as a black wall on the horizon. Veterans of the tropics looked up and felt something wrong in the air. Then the most violent storm in the recorded history of Washington fell on the city like a hammer. A hurricane-force tempest, with a tornado spinning through its heart, came down the center of the capital. Roofs peeled off like paper. Buildings collapsed with British soldiers inside them. Cannons, tons of iron, were lifted off the ground and thrown. Soldiers who had survived Napoleon lay face down in the streets, clawing at the earth while the sky screamed. And the rain, a wall of water so dense it strangled the flames, crashed down onto the burning buildings of Washington and beat the great fires into smoke. There is a story from that afternoon that Washingtonians still tell. A British admiral, sheltering in a doorway, supposedly shouted to a local woman, "Great God, madam, is this the kind of storm you are accustomed to in this infernal country?" And she answered, "No, sir. This is a special interposition of Providence to drive our enemies from our city." Hours later, the British army formed up in the wreckage, left its campfires burning as a decoy, and slipped out of Washington in the dark, back down the long road to the ships. Occupation of the American capital. Total duration, roughly 26 hours. They came through fire, they left through water. Now watch what a nation does at the bottom of its humiliation. Because this is where the story reverses. Madison returned within days to a capital of black skeletons. Congress met in a patent office spared from the flames and seriously debated abandoning Washington forever. Philadelphia was offered. The motion to consider leaving came down to a handful of votes. They chose the ashes. They would rebuild on the exact same ground, as if daring anyone to try again. Thomas Jefferson sold his personal library, 6,487 books, to restart the Library of Congress from zero, and the President's mansion was rebuilt and painted. Brilliant, defiant white, over stones still scarred by smoke. The name that had floated around for years now hardened into permanence. The White House, the most famous building in America, carries a fire in its name. But nations do not run on paint. They run on stories. And America still needed one. It arrived 3 weeks later, at Baltimore. The British fleet moved on the city expecting another Bladensburg. Instead, they found trenches packed with thousands of defenders, and a harbor blocked by sunken ships, and a brick star named Fort McHenry. On September 12th, American sharpshooters killed General Robert Ross, the conqueror of Washington, in the opening skirmish. The army stalled, so the Royal Navy stepped forward to do what the Royal Navy did best for 25 hours. Through the day and through the night of September 13th, British warships hurled somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 bombs and rockets at Fort McHenry. The shells were fused to explode in the air. All night the sky above the fort convulsed with red bursts, each one a camera flash, illuminating for a heartbeat whether the fort still stood. And 8 miles away, trapped aboard a truce ship behind the British fleet, an American lawyer watched every flash. His name was Francis Scott Key. He had come to negotiate a prisoner's release. Now he could not leave until the battle ended. A captive audience to the possible death of his country. All night he watched, the bombs bursting in air, the rockets' red glare. Sound familiar? Before dawn, the guns went silent. And silence was the cruelest possible answer. Had the fort surrendered? Had it fallen? Key stood at the rail in the dark, straining at the horizon, waiting for the light. And when dawn came up over the harbor, he saw it. The commander of Fort McHenry had ordered a flag sewn so large the enemy could not fail to see it. 30 feet by 42 feet, stitched by a Baltimore widow named Mary Pickersgill on the floor of a brewery. It was still there. Key, shaking, pulled a letter from his pocket and began scribbling on the back of it. "Oh, say, can you see? By the dawn's early light, the British fleet gave up and sailed away." And the poem written by a prisoner about a flag over a fort would one day become the national anthem of the United States. A country humiliated in August found its voice in September. The anthem Americans sing at every game, every ceremony, every launch, was born watching the smoke of a war they were losing. The war itself ended in a strange whisper. On December 24th, 1814, diplomats in Belgium signed a peace treaty that returned everything, more or less, to the way it was before. But the ocean was slow, and the news sailed slower. So in January, at New Orleans, a British army attacked a mud rampart defended by Andrew Jackson in a battle fought after the peace was already signed. The result, roughly 2,000 British casualties against a few dozen American. Technically meaningless. Emotionally, everything. America's forgotten war ended on a thunderclap of victory, and the burning of Washington was folded into a national legend of survival. So here is the inversion at the heart of this whole story. August 24th, 1814 should be the darkest date on the American calendar. The day the Capitol burned and the government ran. 26 hours of absolute humiliation. Instead, those 26 hours manufactured almost everything we now recognize as American identity. The White House and its name, The legend of Dolly and the painting. The anthem. The Library of Congress reborn from Jefferson's own shelves. The stubborn decision to rebuild on scorched ground. Before the fire, the United States was an argument. 13 squabbling states, wondering if the experiment would hold. The fire gave the argument a scar. And nations, like people, are built out of their scars. Britain won the battle so completely that it accidentally finished America's founding. The invaders burned the buildings and hardened the idea. They came to end a country and left it with its anthem. Some fires destroy, and some fires, it turns out, are how a nation gets forged. If this story lit something in you, subscribe now, because history is full of nights like this one. Hinges where everything almost went the other way. Next time, we open another one. The past never runs out of secrets.